The silence in the classroom was absolute, the kind that descends only when something sacred begins to unfold. The students had returned to their worksheets after the earlier interruption, their pencils scratching nervously at the paper, but the atmosphere had changed. Something unspoken lingered in the air. Alex Hunter sat still in the back row, a small figure swallowed by the too large desk, his eyes fixed downward, fingers tracing the cool edges of the dog tag resting against his chest. He hadn't looked up since the laughter subsided. His cheeks still burned, not from anger, but from the quiet ache of having told the truth and not been believed. At 10:32 a.m., the latch on the classroom door clicked. The sound was faint, but distinct. It drew every gaze away from textbooks and chalkboard equations. The door opened slowly, without haste, as though the person behind it carried not urgency, but authority. He stepped into the room with quiet precision, a man in a full U.S. Army dress uniform. His presence filled the space before anyone even understood why. He was older, his hair a shade of dignified silver that caught the light and crowned his features with a softness that did little to diminish his severity. His uniform was flawless, medals aligned perfectly, shoes that caught their reflection in the polished tile floor, shoulders squared as if molded by decades of habit. He walked forward with the steadiness of someone who had faced greater storms than discomfort. Past the rows of students, past the teacher who had frozen mid-sentence, past the desks and dangling backpacks, until he reached the last row. He did not glance sideways. His gaze was locked on the boy sitting alone, the boy who hadn't spoken since his story had been doubted. In that moment, the entire class felt the weight of something shifting. He came to a stop before Alex. The boy finally lifted his eyes, uncertain but unafraid, still holding the dog tag with the reverence of someone holding the last piece of a memory too precious to explain. Then, in a move that no one could have anticipated, the man raised his right hand in a formal military salute. It was not a performance. It was a declaration. Every muscle in his frame was drawn taut with respect. The salute was crisp, official, practiced, a gesture that acknowledged not just Alex, but the name engraved on the dog tag he held. The children who had giggled and whispered earlier were now frozen, their mouths half open, their eyes wide. Even the ones who hadn't laughed felt something rise in their chests, an understanding without words. The teacher, Mrs. Blake, looked on, her expression drained of its polite detachment. She stood behind her desk, one hand gripping a stack of papers, her eyes locked on the scene with a dawning realization that this moment was one she would remember for the rest of her career, and perhaps the rest of her life. The man held his salute for a full 5 seconds before lowering his hand slowly, deliberately. Then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a photograph encased in a weathered leather frame. He placed it gently on Alex's desk. The image showed a younger man in dusty combat gear, standing with one boot in the dirt and a steady gaze fixed beyond the camera. Behind him, a tan tent swayed in the dry wind of a foreign country. His posture was protective, grounded, strong. The resemblance was unmistakable. Now the classroom understood. The man in the photograph was Captain Ron Hunter, Alex's father. The same name that had once caused laughter was now causing silence. The kind of silence that said more than apologies ever could. The photograph was not passed around, not lifted or examined by curious fingers. It stayed where it was, resting like a memorial between a boy and his father's legacy. The man standing in front of the class, Colonel Nate Burns, turned and faced the students. He looked at no one in particular, yet his gaze seemed to land on each of them. No words were spoken, but the lesson had big asterisk N in a way no textbook could teach. The children sat straighter. Not out of fear, but out of a new, unspoken respect. They had witnessed something sacred. Mrs. Blake finally stepped forward, her footsteps slow, like someone unsure of how to approach a church altar. She opened her mouth once, then closed it. Her gaze drifted to the photograph, then to the boy she had doubted. The boy who had not tried to prove himself, who had not raised his voice when mocked. Who had simply held on to what he knew was true. Colonel Burns turned back to Alex, and in a motion that bore the grace of ritual, he removed a small brass coin from his breast pocket. It was darkened at the edges from handling, its surface etched with an emblem of honor known only to those who had served. He placed it beside the photograph and gave a slight nod. Then he straightened and stepped back. Alex remained motionless, his fingers hovering over the coin as though afraid to disturb its place. But in his eyes, something shifted. Not pride. Not victory. Something quieter. A release. As if the weight he had carried alone had finally found space to breathe. The students who had once doubted now sat in humbled quiet, many with their heads lowered, their hands idle on blank worksheets. A few stole glances at Alex, not with ridicule, but with reverence. The shift was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was slow, like ice melting beneath morning sun. It was understanding dawning. The colonel nodded once more, turned, and walked back down the rows, his footsteps measured, unhurried. As he reached the doorway, he paused. Without looking back, he adjusted his cap and exited, the door closing behind him with a soft but resolute click. Only then did the room exhale. Something had changed. And though no one had spoken a single word, every child in that room knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, not the arrival of a decorated soldier, but the arrival of truth. The door closed behind the colonel, but its echo lingered like a held breath in the stillness of the classroom. For a moment, everything remained frozen, the desks, the faces, the unfinished arithmetic problems on the board. Then the quiet resumed its natural rhythm, no longer hollow with doubt, but full of something heavier. Recognition. Alex didn't move. His fingers rested lightly on the brass coin left by the man in uniform, as if touching it might summon something too powerful to name. The photograph beside it stood upright, its image glowing faintly beneath the ceiling lights. In that captured moment, Captain Ron Hunter seemed almost alive, the dust of his boots still settling, the weight of command in his stance unmistakable. His eyes, steady and worn, looked out across the decades and straight into his son's future. It wasn't long before the principal arrived. A quiet knock at the door preceded her entrance, though by now everyone expected another ripple in the morning's unfolding tide. Her heels clicked softly as she entered, her professional calm momentarily unsettled when she saw the photo and the coin. She whispered something to Mrs. Blake, who nodded, pale-faced and subdued, and gently placed a hand on Alex's shoulder. For the first time since the lesson began, he was asked to stand, not in punishment, not in challenge, but with invitation. They led him to the office, not with urgency, but with a kind of ceremony. The hallway was empty, but news travels faster than footsteps in small schools. By the time Alex passed the library, someone had already informed the staff. His mother, Joanna, the school librarian, emerged from behind a stack of returned books, eyes wide with confusion that quickly sharpened into concern. She saw the coin in his hand, the photograph tucked under his arm, and she knew. She reached for him instinctively, not to question, but to steady herself. In the principal's office, Colonel Burns waited. He had returned ahead of them, standing near the window with his cap in hand, gazing out at the bare trees that bordered the playground. When Joanna entered, he turned, not with formality, but with quiet respect. The moment stretched between them, heavy with memories, heavy with names never spoken aloud in school walls. He introduced himself again, this time with full context. His voice was calm, yet every syllable carried the weight of loss and gratitude. He had served with Ron. More than that, he had owed Ron his life. He described the mission, years earlier, in a part of the world far removed from Oregon's pine trees and school bells. An ambush in a remote village. Chaos. Smoke. Shouts. The heat of fire and the coldness of fear. Captain Ron Hunter had refused evacuation, had pulled soldiers from overturned vehicles, had shouted until his voice broke, had shielded a younger colonel with his own body when the final blast came. In that chaos, a life had been exchanged for others. The colonel produced a folder. Inside were service records, commendations, and photographs. Letters of recognition never sent. Photos of a younger Ron laughing with his unit, standing beside Humvees with paint worn from sandstorms. They placed the documents gently on the desk as if they were relics. And in a way, they were. Joanna listened without blinking. Her hands trembled as she reached for the paper that bore her husband's name in bold ink, signed by generals who had never met Alex, never seen the dinner table where an empty seat was always left. The silence in the room became reverent. Alex watched his mother, his eyes measuring her reaction. She smiled, just barely, and placed one hand over his. It was the kind of smile made of memory and sorrow stitched together with pride. That afternoon, word rippled through the school faster than any announcement. An emergency assembly was called, an unusual move on a Monday. Teachers lined the hallways, speaking in hushed voices. Students filed into the gymnasium with the restless curiosity of youth, but their energy dimmed when they saw the photograph displayed on the projector screen. Alex sat in the front row, beside his mother. On his lap, the coin rested against the polished metal of his dog tag. Colonel Burns took the podium, his dress uniform still crisp, his voice now amplified but no less solemn. He told the gathered students and staff who Captain Ron Hunter was, not the fantasy of a child, but the fact of a man. He spoke of duty without reward, of sacrifice without witness. He spoke not to glorify war, but to remind everyone of the quiet courage that often goes unnoticed. He ended his address with the words engraved on a plaque that had been quietly mounted outside the library that morning: "He taught by action, not words." No one applauded. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because no sound could match the gravity of what had been restored. The laughter that once filled the classroom was gone, replaced by something that held more weight: respect, earned not by explanation, but by endurance. By the time students returned to their classes, Alex's story had spread beyond the walls of Pine Creek Elementary. That evening, the local news ran a feature. The image of a young boy holding a brass coin beside his father's photograph moved quietly through social media. But none of those things mattered to Alex. What mattered was that the truth had not only been seen, it had been believed. At home that night, the coin rested on the mantel, beside a folded flag and a wedding photo. The silence at the dinner table felt different now, less empty, more like a moment being shared across time. In the weeks that followed, the photograph remained displayed in the school library, centered on a velvet-draped table between a glass case of military memorabilia and a shelf of history books. The plaque below it was simple, without embellishment. He taught by action, not words. Students passed it daily, often pausing just a moment longer than necessary. Teachers found themselves speaking in gentler tones. Something unspoken had changed, not just in the boy who sat silently with his books, but in the rhythm of the entire school. Alex no longer occupied the farthest corner of the classroom. He wasn't placed in the front either, like a trophy. Instead, his seat was by the window where he could see the trees swaying beyond the soccer field. He still rarely spoke, but when he did, others listened. Not because they were told to, but because silence had taught them what dignity sounded like. On Memorial Day, the school held a ceremony in the gymnasium. Parents attended, veterans were invited, and a color guard stood at attention beneath the bleachers. At the center of the stage, an empty chair was set with care. Draped over the back of the chair hung Alex's father's dog tag, suspended by a thin black cord. No words explained the chair, yet everyone understood. The school band played softly, their notes trembling in the still air. When the time came for a speaker, it wasn't a teacher or administrator who stepped forward. It was Alex. Small for his age, hands tucked into the sleeves of his blazer, he stood behind the podium for a long moment before he spoke. He didn't tell stories of battle. He didn't repeat what the colonel had said. He only told them that his father used to say, "When you're scared, do the next right thing anyway." He said it slowly, like the words had to be earned again before they could be passed on. Then he stepped down and returned to his seat, where his mother sat waiting with her hand on his shoulder. After the ceremony, the veterans who attended lined up to shake Alex's hand. One by one. Some said nothing. Some offered a salute. Colonel Burns was the last. He bent slightly and whispered something only Alex heard. Whatever it was, the boy smiled, just enough to change the shape of the room. The story reached further than Pine Creek. Local news grew into national coverage. Not headlines of war or scandal, but something quieter. A boy, a coin, a photograph, a truth held too long in silence. Cadet academies wrote letters asking Alex to visit. Veterans organizations sent patches, letters, even medals that had once belonged to men who served with Captain Hunter. Each item was placed carefully in a growing display in the school. Not behind glass to be forgotten, but beside library shelves where children could reach them. Teachers began to take part in training on how to support children from military families. New bulletin boards were added that celebrated acts of everyday kindness. The school's culture slowly bent toward something gentler, firmer, more rooted. It wasn't mandated. It wasn't discussed in staff meetings. It simply happened. Outside of school, Alex and his mother found themselves no longer navigating grief alone. Colonel Burns visited regularly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to bring old photos or letters Ron had written from the field. Through him, Alex met people who had once fought beside his father. Each visit brought new stories, new pieces of the man who had once carried a baby boy on his shoulders through the snowy woods behind their old home. Alex began to write. Not journals, not essays, just simple pages about things his father had done. About the sound of boots in gravel, or the way his mother looked when she read the mail in the hallway. His stories weren't long, but each one was a kind of repair. One spring morning, the mayor of Pine Creek invited the Hunter family to City Hall. In a small ceremony, the town officially renamed the footpath behind the school Hunter's Way. A plaque was placed at its entrance with an image of the dog tag and the inscription, "A quiet path for those who lead by doing." People gathered. Not just officials, but neighbors, teachers, students. Even those who had once questioned the story. They stood in the warmth of the May sun, heads bowed not in shame, but in respect. The same children who had laughed now left notes beneath the memorial in the library, small slips of paper with thanks, drawings, and names of their own family members who had served. The school counselor began keeping a book of these notes, titled Simply Remembered. By the end of the school year, Mrs. Blake stood before her class, the same chalkboard behind her where doubt had once taken root. She told them that the most important lessons they would ever learn couldn't be found in a textbook. That sometimes, believing someone, quietly, without proof, was a kind of courage on its own. At home, Joanna replaced a cracked frame in their hallway with the photo Colonel Burns had brought that first day. She added the brass coin beneath it, glued carefully into the corner, a tiny circle of metal that had altered the course of her son's life. Alex passed it every morning on his way to school. He never touched it, never needed to. Its presence was enough. In time, he would grow. In time, the grief would change shape. But the memory of what had happened that day, the door opening, the salute, the weight of silence turning into something solid, would remain. Not as pain. Not as victory. But as proof that kindness, when held with dignity, can be stronger than disbelief. That truth, carried gently, finds its way home. And that sometimes, all it takes to change everything is the steady hand of a boy holding a tag, waiting for someone to see. Kindness without question is enough.